Good evening, everyone. If you haven't had a chance to grab some snacks and cookies, please feel free to go ahead and do that. My name is Jason Kahns, and I am a member of the anthropology department here at UT. Welcome to this roundtable on food and justice amidst multiple crises. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coshada, Caddo Carrizo, Tonocrudo, Guapiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Nippon Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or who have become part of these lands and territories in Texas. Tonight's roundtable is part of a colloquium being held this semester at the Rappaport Center titled Cultures of Environmental Justice. Our final event in this series will be on April 3rd, next Monday, and will take place at our usual location in the law school, that is in the Sheffield Massey room on the first floor from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. There will be a talk by Dr. Alex Nading of Cornell University titled Social Security, Injury, and Agrarian Futures in Nicaragua's Sugarcane Zone. You are all most welcome to attend. I wish to thank the Rappaport Center and especially its directors, Karen Engel and Neville Hode, for making the series possible. I wish to also thank Caroline Hahn, Program Coordinator at the Rappaport Center, for her work throughout this series and especially for tonight's event. Thank you so much. I wish also to thank the Colloquium Series co-sponsors, Planet Texas 2050, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, the South Asia Institute, Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Teresa Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies, and the Departments of Geography, Anthropology, and City and Regional Planning. And I wish to particularly thank Planet Texas 2050 and the LBJ School for their generous support of tonight's event. So we come together tonight for a conversation about the implications of working and organizing for change in a moment that's defined by cascading crises, medical, financial, climatic, and more. This phenomena of converging crises, which some have begun referring to as the polycrisis, defines contemporary challenges in activism, law, and policy domains. So with some hesitation, I'll use this term polycrisis in conversations tonight, mostly because the only term I could think of as an alternative was multi-crisis, which kind of sounds like an Avenger movie. So we'll use this particular jargon. As many commentators have noted, the interactions between the challenges that make up the polycrisis can be convergent and often multiplicative, themselves creating new conditions of dispossession, violence, abandonment, and inequality. Tonight, we're going to inquire into what this looks like across a rich variety of sites and scales, from community-based engagement to international development policy. As importantly, we will explore not just the new forms of deprivation that the polycrisis brings, but we will ask what kinds of opportunities for change, new strategies for working towards just futures, and new solidarities might open in and through this polycrisis. This is a roundtable discussion, of course, so we may go off script at any moment, but our conversation will focus loosely on questions around food, availability, production, distribution, safety, justice. Now, in some sense, food is simply an opportunistic place to begin a conversations about forces that affect social life at large. But food is, of course, also fundamentally at the core of conversations about justice, risk, development, and community, no more so than in the present. I'll ask panelists a series of questions about the relationship between the polycrisis and their work, and we will reserve ample time for Q&A towards the end of our discussion. We're fortunate to be joined tonight by a panel of esteemed researchers, organizers, and activists working at the cutting edge of their various fields. These include author, activist, filmmaker, and research professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Raj Patel. Raj's work has long focused on a suite of questions around justice and injustice in the food system and in world ecology writ large. He's the author most recently of Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice with Rupa Maria, and co-director of the film The Ants and the Grasshopper. Carolina Mueller, apologies, is coalition manager of the National Young Farmers Coalition, an organization that works to shift power and change policy to equitably resource our new generation of working farmers. Carolina describes herself as a tenacious cook, gardener, weekend rancher, and food systems practitioner. She's also a recent graduate of the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Welcome back. Alex Racelis is joining us tonight on Zoom, and we're happy to have him, even though we wish he was here in person. He's an assistant professor in the School of Earth, Environmental, and Marine Sciences at UTRGV. His lab uses a range of methods, including participatory action research, to better understand how agriculture, urban development, invasive species, and resource management affects certain ecological processes in light of pressing social and environmental issues. Doris Brown and Ben Hirsch are co-directors of West Street Recovery in Houston, an organization whose mission is to connect communities to the resources that they need, not only to rebuild after climate disasters, such as Hurricane Harvey, but to build communities that are resilient, secure, and stronger than before. Doris is also the co-founder of Northeast Action Coalition, and Ben is another recent graduate of the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Finally, Erin Lentz is an associate professor here at the LBJ School. She's a noted expert on, among other things, humanitarian interventions around food. Erin's research portfolio is broad, but her current work variously explores the relationship between nutrition, gender, and empowerment, the social life of famine, and early warning systems in humanitarian relief. And for those of you who are interested in seeing more of her work, tomorrow evening she'll present a talk at the Herbert Family University Lecture Series here on campus on machine learning, local knowledge, and the future of the global food system. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming this evening's panel. So let me first ask, can everyone hear okay out there? And Alex, can you hear us okay on Zoom? Yeah, okay. Great. So I would like to start this evening's conversation by asking all the panelists the same question. And that question is specifically we live in a moment of tremendous flux and multiple cascading crises. I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your work and how it's been shaped by these multiple crises over the past few years. And I think we may as well start with Carolina and just move on down the line.
Right on. Hey everyone, are you an LBJ student? If you are, raise your hand. Hey, all right. I just graduated in 21, so I'm like, I don't know, my mind is blown that I'm sitting on a panel of experts here. It's like, that's insane, but so stoked that y'all are here. Even if you came just for the snack, that is a great reason to be here. I am a person who is all about the snacks, so welcome. So another way that we could refer to these polycrises is the everything everywhere all at once crises. So the way that young farmers are experiencing them is from every direction, right? So young farmers are trying to enter into a career that where it is impossible to get the very basic things that you need, land. Your business will not be successful. Labor is getting more expensive and your vendors don't want to pay, or your customers don't want to pay you anymore. There's going to be at least one catastrophic climate situation every year, probably, if you're lucky, only one. And I don't know, should I keep going? The fabric of our society is crumbling. So everything's awesome. So the thing that keeps, so why would you get into farming? That's like, ridiculous. There is something that is calling us back. Right. There's about 78% of young farmers, according to our most recent survey, which I have some printouts over here. Please feel free to pass them around, and then please make sure that I get them back. They were not cheap. Please take a look through them. So what we found is that almost 80% of young farmers identify as first generation, right? So that means that there has been at least one generation of interruption between a family being agricultural and now we are getting back to it. And so that resonates with me, right? My grandfather was a farmer. My dad, bless his heart, he's not very good for anything, outside of like, doing tech stuff, right? And so there was something that calls us back to being in a relationship with land, with producing food that you then watch the people that you love eat in a place where you are seeing the ways that the critters and the plants and the animals and the bugs and the water and everything are interacting with one another. And that is, I do not want you to leave thinking that farming sounds nice. That sounds like a nice thing for me to do. It sucks. It's hot. My body couldn't take it. That's why I am not farming, right? It's expensive to get into, and yet, right, there's something bigger that is calling us back to it, because when you see a fissure, you also see an opportunity to get in there and do something different. And that is that unbridled hopefulness, I think, that we're bringing into our work. And so our job at the National Young Farmers Coalition is to make sure that that happens. And it might not be successfully completed in our lifetime, and things will continue to be difficult. And that's why we have to hold steady, right? And that's why we'll talk a little bit later about why we work the way that we do. But we're getting it from all sides. And so that means there is an infinite opportunity to improve things, right? Because we can really only go up from here. So that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you. Raj?
Well, I'll keep it short because I'm going to try and answer the same question now and in a second. But the question I'm interested in, how does something become a crisis, and what is it that legitimates that crisis? And it turns out that I wanted to address what appear to be the multiple crises of disenfranchisement from land and poverty and racial exploitation, and particularly not the exploitation of the global South by the global North. And I became a policy analyst, and I wrote beautiful policy briefs of the kinds that they teach you in this fine establishment, and literally dozens of people read them, and change didn't happen. And so I found myself needing to looking into how it is that you make the change happen, and how you make the policy more effective. And so I found myself doing a bit more sort of articulating what was already circulating in society as a sort of subliminal crisis, and trying to bring things to the surface. So, for example, I did a book ages ago called Stuffed and Starved, which is why, asking the question, why are there back then 1 billion people who are overweight and 1 billion people who are food insecure? Clearly that work didn't land, because now the numbers are 2 billion and 2 billion. But a lot of the work that I've found myself doing is trying to stay just a step ahead of where mainstream media, or where sort of the general will has found itself, and trying to push it in a way that is able to articulate different kinds of crises happening at the same time. So in the past, it's been trying to do work around obesity and food insecurity. More recently, it's been around health. So Inflamed, we got the book contract just before the pandemic, and then we worked through the pandemic to make clear how it is that a broken food system is guaranteed to spit out diseases like COVID. I mean, we'd already seen 2 other major respiratory diseases come from the food system, and COVID was the bullet that we didn't dodge. So that's what Inflamed ended up being. And so, I mean, and the film project that will be in fact screening here next week is The Ants and the Grasshopper, again, about climate change and the sort of innovations that come from grassroots communities. All of this is just a way of saying that the way that I've been doing my work is trying to sort of read the tea leaves of essentially what mainstream capitalist society is up to, and trying to nudge it in the direction that at least provides some tools for people trying to ratchet in slightly better policies than the ones that might otherwise happen. That's my bit.
Thanks, Doris.
I blurred out in 2017, and you don't expect Well, you expect the government to help you or something like that, but that wasn't the case, and I had been refused. That was my second time being refused. And this made me angry because they used our neighbor, I live in Northeast Houston. And our neighborhood and communities have been, we are sacrifice zones. We have all the cement batches, we have all the refineries, we have antiquated structure because we have been historically disinvested. So everyone, either get, if you leave out your neighborhood, you get flooded out, you can't get back in your house for at least 35 to 40 minutes. If you in your neighborhood, you cannot get out because it is, streets are just covered with water. Even in a hard rain, we flood. We don't have to have a hurricane or anything that stops us. There are kids wading through water that got toxic waste and everything in it. And then the pandemic hit us, okay? So I have went through, we had a phenomenal freeze. The grid shut down, so a lot of people died for this. And they died during Harvard too, because we are the sacrifice zones. They put us out there, they take our money, our tax money, they don't put anything in. Then we had another freeze, and we had some small type, like in Melville, tax day flood and stuff like this. And this cuts us out from everyone else. We are food deserts. We don't have stores out there. We have little mom and pop convenience type stores, and there's no place to get fresh fruit or anything that you might need. So I guess this is very disheartening. So some of my neighbors in the neighborhoods, in the neighborhood, we all got together and we started the Northeast Action Collective because we were tired of being disenfranchised and disinvested. It was very discouraged, but we want to stand up for ourselves. So that we got together, we started the Northeast Action Collective, and through this group of people, of residents, who were all impacted by all of this, the food desert, we all got together, we started weekly meetings along with West Street Recovery. They taught us, they enlightened us, they encouraged us, and they empowered us to do something different about our situation. So I guess that's enough for me to talk about that right now. But this is, I could go on forever about this because it still kind of makes me a little angry. Yeah. I don't want to say mad, so I'm gonna say I was angry. And I'm still a little angry about it because our municipalities still do not step up and do the things that they're supposed to do in our BIPOC neighborhoods. I'm gonna put on that.
Thank you, Doris.
Ben, do you want to go next and talk about West Street Recovery?
Sure. I think that does make sense. So I met Doris badly doing repair of her ceiling because I have a policy degree and I'm not a construction worker. The question is, how are we impacted by the poly crisis basically, and what are we doing about it? So I think that in everything that Doris said is true. Doris is also co-director at West Street Recovery now. And what we are trying to do, so one thing to know is that after a disaster, the wealth gap between white and Black families at the median grows by an average of $127,000 in over a decade. Between Latinx families, it's $119,000 over a decade. And actually, a huge amount of this is because white people get really rich from disasters. It's not just that disasters are a mechanism that is used to dispossess Black people and brown people through government action, which it very much is. The USDA says that 40,000 Black families lost their homes after Katrina due to limitations on aid that properties in Airship can get. So Airship property means that your house was not inherited by a single person, it was like heired to your whole family, which is what happens if you don't have a family lawyer. You know, if you don't have a will, that's what the state of Texas says happens to your house. And then if you flood in that situation or there's a hurricane, you're ineligible for government assistance because there is no owner of the house. Because we can only understand ownership in the sort of like really colonial property relation, right? Where you're like one dad and you own a house. And so what we're trying to do is two things. The first thing is we are just trying to put walls up and make sure the water keeps running. Because frankly, you know, people die because of these, the slow process of disaster. So a few people died during the disaster, but many, many more died in the 6 or 7 months after the disaster from just a degradation of living conditions. So like BuzzFeed said that, Texas said that the winter freeze killed 61 people. BuzzFeed says it killed 790 people. You know, FEMA said 74 people died in Maria or something. Harvard did a longitudinal study and said 3,800 people died. That study has never been done for Harvey. I've asked professors here to do it and they've said, look, I don't know what you're talking about. No, I did. I never asked anybody. But so what we're trying to do is, one is like stop the bleeding, so to speak, and make sure that there is a community to work in. And then the other thing that we're trying to do is to use every lever that we possibly can pull to undo some of those really the ways in which policy and the weather combine to kill people. That really is what they're doing. And so we try to make changes in eligibility for aid. We try to make changes in the way in which risk is communicated. We try to, one thing that I've been working on for a long time is try to do zip code level income testing as opposed to household level income testing. So like if the median income in a zip code is at a certain level, there should be no means testing on the household level. Because there's benefits to everyone. So these are kind of some policy things that we're doing. And then I think the most important thing that we're doing is when I took Raj's class 6 years ago or something, he asked, what is doing solidarity? Like, what the hell does that mean? And I think what we're trying to do is really be in community with each other. And I think that one of the things that we're really good at is people in the NAC say like, this is like a family. And it actually is like a family in that people are always pissing each other off. There's a lot of disputes about like who is taking what and is it fair? And then at the end of the day, like people just keep showing up for each other over and over again. And it's sort of like it's the most brutally honest workspace I've been in, and we probably wouldn't be considered like appropriate. Like we're an unprofessional workplace. No, we are. And that's part of
that of trust.
Yeah, because we have, exactly, yeah, because we're trying to build a really high level of trust. And because the really high level of trust is key, if you're gonna look like me and then you're gonna go into Doris's house and say, let me help you fill out these forms. It just, most people aren't actually able to convince someone else to help them fill out the forms, even if they wanted to.
And then we have that language justice, you know, we're all inclusive.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of, that's a great point. We've been doing a lot of work because we have a fully bilingual group. So everything we do has simultaneous English to Spanish interpretation. And we also have, we had one very enthusiastic blind community member who participated. And now we have like 7 or 8 of the 60 people that come to a meeting every single week are blind. So now we're like really learning all together about how do you include people like this. And I think the professionalism is a good example. So we had this big meeting with lots of people external from the organizations, and one of the blind members for Rondo kept in the back, hey, I can't see. And it was very disheartening, but I think he felt like it's so stuffy in here, like all these people, and like I just gonna make a little joke here to kind of like shake it up, because this just feels a little too formal for me, and he didn't feel comfortable, so he was making a joke about himself being blind. And I think we try to be really inclusive and also really familiar. And that's how we deal with it. That's all, and I'll quit on that.
I love the idea of trust as being an unprofessional workplace.
Professionalism doesn't make people trust each other more.
Not at all.
It means you're hiding stuff as a requirement.
And when you come into a neighborhood and you live up to your word, that builds trust. That's where the trust comes in. 'Cause if I say I'm gonna do something, I do it, you know, that's it. That's the way it feels. That's how we become a family. Trust me.
Okay, well, so speaking of trust, I work in the kind of low-income space, and more recently I've been working in low-income country space. More recently I've been working with kind of humanitarian donors and organizations and state governments. And the reason why I've been in this particular space is I decided with some colleagues, like, oh, maybe we'll try to use this fancy machine learning stuff and build a model to try to estimate where there's food insecurity. And the reason why we thought this was so important is because I used to do a lot of work on food aid and food assistance, and food aid and food assistance often takes 3 to 5 months to arrive. That is long after when people need it, when there's a crisis, right? And so I was like, okay, we can do a better job identifying earlier where this might need to go. That would potentially really improve people's lives. So can we build a model to do early warning? So we built this model, and we're so awesome. So we built this model, and it turns out it does not help at all. And you know, and I think that this was like a real learning for us. Like, surprise! And it's not to say it didn't totally help, but we made this model that it really kind of opened up this whole set of questions for us around, you know, what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve. And I think that there's kind of 2 ways to think about this in the modeling space. Specifically, the first is that the decisions that policymakers, donors, state governments are facing are really quite specific, and the modeling community does not understand them at all. And so there's this huge gap between what the kind of modeling kind of super teched up folks are doing and the decisions that actually policy and programmers are trying to take. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to bridge that. But that I'd say is, you know, so we're talking about this as this co-production. So how do we get people in the room? The other piece of this is who are the people who get to be in the room, right? So it's like quite easy to be like, oh, hey, you know, Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs, like talk to me about what you need in a model. It is much harder to improve early warning systems for affected populations and to engage with affected populations to understand what are they needing to make decisions for themselves. A kind of a classic horrendous example that I come back to a lot is, you know, there are really excellent models out there on flooding. Like the modeling community is doing a really good job identifying when and where things are going to flood. There is very often in countries that know when floods are going to happen, there is no effort to disseminate that information to people downstream of the flooding. So the government knows there's going to be a flood. The county knows there's going to be a flood. The people who live in the floodplain do not know there's going to be a flood. And so I think that this is where the kind of, for me, the justice piece is really missing from these kinds of conversations, because so much of it is really focused on addressing the needs of folks who are kind of holding the purse strings, but who are not necessarily experiencing the impacts. So we've been trying to think more carefully about ways to basically push the modeling community to engage more with affected populations. That's like one piece. The other piece is we've been also really worrying a lot about kind of cascading risks. So for example, a lot of these models are built with one idea in mind, right? So I'm just going to look at what's happening with drought, or I'm going to look at what's happening with crisis. But we know those interact together and oftentimes amplify, right? And so a classic example is we knew that there was going to be drought in East Africa. That was very well documented ahead of time. Sort of in 2021, people were already talking about there's this potential for famine in Somalia, and we need to be paying attention. On top of that, the Ukraine-Russian conflict, which then also increased prices, right? And so now we're looking at a situation where there's drought, people are growing less there, they need to import more, prices are higher, right? And so it's this kind of cascade of crisis, this compound risk. And I think that the community of kind of policymakers are really struggling with how to coherently put these together to understand when things are going to amplify. Right. And so that's another piece of work that I've been thinking about. That's right.
Thanks, Erin. Alex?
Yes, first of all, my apologies for not being there in person. I wish I could join you guys. I'm actually calling you guys from Miami, Florida, where I just got called in to some emergency duty for some parental care. We're dealing with some, my in-laws are very old and one of them fell last week. So we're here trying to provide some emergency care. So my apologies. I missed out on the snacks. I just have some fennel seeds that I'm eating, chewing on here. So thanks, Carolina, for making me feel like I'm missing out on some really good food. And of course, the company, right? I mean, I've already appreciated hearing about all of your work. It's nice to meet you all, and there's some of you guys I haven't met yet. Again, my name is Alex. I'm a professor here at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And let me just see, I can't see the audience at all, but how many of you guys have visited the Rio Grande Valley? If you don't mind raising your hands. And then Raj, if you can give me a count of like a percentage of folks.
So 6, I want to say maybe 10%.
Okay, 10%. Well, look, you guys should know, for those who live in Texas, you should know the Rio Grande Valley because it's one of the true agricultural hubs of the state. So the Rio Grande Valley is the largest producer of fruits and vegetables in the entire state of Texas. There's 4 counties along the US-Mexico border. And really what makes it unique is that it's actually a different climate, a different zone. If you go down there, we grow bananas, papayas, avocados. It's as tropical as we can get in the United States. In fact, the southmost part of the tip of Texas is one of the southernmost parts of the United States outside of the Keys. And so we have a very unique area here. It's considered arid in terms of its climate. We don't get very much rainfall, and definitely not as much as Houston, but we do get enough to be able to grow some tremendous amount of crops. Most of our water comes from the Rio Grande River, but we do get enough rainfall to feed about 2.6 million acres of rain-fed agriculture. That includes corn, sorghum, cotton, soybean, sugarcane. And so I work in that context. I work in this context of this agricultural hub. But I also want to point out that the Rio Grande Valley has the highest rates of food-related diseases in the entire country. In fact, I think it was rated just recently as the most obese city in America, McAllen, Texas, which is the big economic center of the Rio Grande Valley. We have the highest rates of food insecurity in the entire country. We have some of the poorest counties in the country. So we're in the top 1%. The 4 counties rank in the top 1% of the poorest counties in the entire country. There's over 3,000 counties in the United States. And so what we're really seeing in the Rio Grande Valley is a true paradox. And so this is actually a walking example of what Jason calls a polycrisis, because we have multiple issues that we're dealing with. And what we see is probably one of the most disconnected food systems in the country, where we have plenty of food, and those who work and live in those areas can't afford or don't have physical or economic access to that food. And in the same context, we have growers who are trying to grow food as best as they can, but are dealing with prolonged periods of drought, increasing major storms. Like 2 years ago, for example, we got our amount of rainfall. Our average amount is about 21 inches, and we got our full year because on June 21st, it rained 19 inches, and for the rest of the year, it rained 2. So, these are the challenges that we work with in the context in which I work. I do a lot of research with farmers in particular. As a trained agricultural scientist, I do a lot of participatory action research with farmers on how to deal with things like pests, weeds, invasive plants, as well as soil fertility and soil health. I lead a organic transitions program to certified organic. But more importantly, I try to understand the privileged position that I have as a highly educated person in my community and the potential we have to lead students and my counterparts towards action. So I've been here for about 10 years, and both my kids were born in the Rio Grande Valley. So I have been able to become a member of my community. And with that comes the trust that comes with being a community member. I work with a lot of organizations that allow me access because they see me as a member of that community. We work with farm workers, we work with farmers, we work with food producers, and when I say we, it's in my lab. It's a fairly big lab, and so I'm excited to talk to you guys more about some of the work we're doing in the context of today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks to everyone for that first round of questions. I think that there's it's impressive what the depth of different kinds of problems that everyone is working on, but also the similarities, not just in the ways that they converge, but in the particular ways all of you are thinking about response. And so I'd like to ask a set of questions that are kind of loosely organized around that. What kinds of possibilities organize or emerge out of this? So I'll start with Raj. I know that you've been spending a lot of time thinking about this question of the poly crisis. And I know it's a concept that's been discussed significantly and quite a bit with groups that you're working with, probably both with ire and skepticism, but maybe with curiosity. And so I'm curious to know what kinds of possibilities are opened up in the space of multiple crises for new strategies of organizing, what kind of possibilities you see in pressing claims for justice and equity in either old or new ways. And what kinds of opportunities to this current moment of challenge?
Thanks, Jason. And by the way, I also just want to echo what you're saying. It's awesome to see students here, but it's also awesome to just be among some of the best people in the UT system, including Alex. It's just so fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing us together. I understand that there are some people who are here because they have to be. Are you, you just raise your hands if you're taking the class associated with this lecture series? No, I mean, it's not a bad thing. I'm just curious. Because I understand that, you know, I mean, we're here in part to serve you. So I want to just complicate your lives a little bit by thinking a little bit more about the poly crisis, right? I mean, you hear this term, and its origins are from a couple of fairly obscure European environmentalists who write it in 1999 when they talk about sort of multiple solidaristic overlapping crises. And then it gets picked up in the early 2000s by Jean-Claude Juncker, and then it crops up again increasingly in Adam Tooze's work. And he's a sort of economist, a sort of lefty economist, who bangs on about the poly crisis all the time. And because he's very good at weaving together, so, you know, essentially a lot of visual communication around how crises gets to be mapped out and rendered visual in particular ways, and also because he's very smart when explaining the financial crises, of which we've had not a small number recently. You know, the term poly crisis just sort of gets into the ether. Now, I come across it and find myself pissed off about it through a particular route, which is that I'm an activist. You may be able to tell that by the way that I overestimated the crowd size earlier. I do a lot of work with groups in the global south, right? In engaging this kind of solidarity and you know, working with groups over decades. And so I was hanging out with some comrades in South Africa in Durban with a group called Abahlali Basedlondolo, which means in English it's the South African Shack Dwellers Movement. It is now the largest non-trade union organization in the United States. It has 120,000 members. You know, these people who live in shacks and pay dues to this organization. And initially, the organization understood the crisis that they were facing was a crisis about housing, and a crisis about vulnerability from extreme weather, a lack of access to electricity, because shacks with these temporary spaces with the ANC allowed to flourish in white neighborhoods where folk after the end of apartheid, folk used to come in and vote for the ANC in constituencies that otherwise, because they were white middle class, what might have voted for some other party. And so the ANC had a vested interest in transforming the demography of particular bits of urban South African cities so that the ANC would win in landslides. But the condition of shacks was always meant to be temporary and has become permanent. So the crisis was initially a housing crisis, but it's also like we need electricity because if we don't have electricity, then we have to use fossil fuels, and fossil fuels burn, and then we have shack fires, and the entire shacks have been sort of burned down. So already it was a crisis about housing, but it was also a crisis about fuel and about energy and about water and about flooding because the shacks were in precarious places. But then, I mean, increasingly, as the ANC became oppositional to these shack settlements, the crisis spread to being about the police. And I think this is an important and missing discussion on when we think about the poly crisis, because the weather we've got, the insecurity of tenure on land, we've got that. The increasing sort of extremity of climate shock, we've got that too. But when people try to, for example, engage in redistribution of property in order to survive, if it's in black communities, it's looting, and if it's white communities, you see it on Fox, it's just families trying to help themselves and their kids. The idea here is what I want to do with the idea of poly crisis is suggest that the poly crisis for social movements has always been about these multiple interlocking crises plus the police. And we began this session today with a land acknowledgement. And the land acknowledgement is necessary, but it always, it's a way of saying, oh, we should probably feel a little bit bad about the land we're on. But if we're serious about it, we also need to understand that there was state violence that happened and continues to be maintained by the police to allow us to be on this land and to move forward in a way that allows us to be untroubled, except for these brief moments where we do the land acknowledgement as a kind of sort of genuflection to that moment, but then we move on. So when I was in South Africa, my comrade Lido Nguni was setting up an agroecological farm. And it was fantastic. He was building soil fertility. He was figuring out how to make the swales work. And in fact, I had high hopes, Alex, would be able to hook you up with them to be able to figure out some of this stuff. And the land that they were on was promised to an ANC grande. And so 3 of the Ngutle's comrades were assassinated weeks before I got there. And the week after I left, he was killed. And then 2 weeks after that, there was this conference on the poly crisis that I've been invited to. Because there was money associated with this at the end, I went and we set up a grant to do, addressing the poly crisis. But the fact is no one in South Africa calls it the poly crisis because it's always been one. And the thing that matters most is the things you're not allowed to say about the poly crisis, which is the violence of the state. And that, I think, is important for y'all who are here trying to understand, well, what constitutes the crisis? What constitutes a problem? What constitutes a problem for social movements may not be what gets surfaced in a university. The only things the things that allow crises to surface in universities are funders, are donors. I mean, why is it that the Rappaport Center is running this particular thing? It's because, that there was a conversation between Rappaport Centers. I mean, I'm not outing anyone here. This is the way universities work. The level,
You've got to fund to do work on ecological justice.
Right. And so
not enough, not nearly enough.
No, exactly.
But I mean, and then we rely on the volunteer labor, like President Khan. I mean,
right. And so and I think it's just important for the folk who are here attending the class to know that your knowledge has already been curated by where the money goes. And that's not the same thing as understanding where the crises are. So when you hear the word poly crisis, don't assume that sits directly on where the crises are. It's just mediated by where the donors have allowed the light to shine. But movements on the ground have always had their own light, and that's where I'll end on that. So let's play this more.
Thanks, Raj. So I mean, on the topic of shining lights on movements that are doing things in a slightly different way, I want to direct my next question to Carolina. So I'm an anthropologist, and there's something that I absolutely fundamentally love about the mission statement of the Young Farmers Coalition, which is, or your theory of change, which is, and I'll read it here. Young farmers, when resourced and trained to share their stories with lawmakers, can remake the food system to be more equitable, just, and in service to our communities and the land. So I'd love to hear more about the ways that the National Young Farmers Coalition thinks about mobilizing stories to these ends. What counts as a win within that context, and what kind of training you feel people need to get to, in order to sort of mobilize their story in their ways?
Thank you. All right, so all of your expectations right now are here because of what Rod just touched on. So I want you to just. There's a reason I'm not in academia. I like to listen to smart people talk, and then I just like, I'm a potato who does stuff. Okay, so yeah, so we have a very it's a very like, for the first time, so we were founded about 13 years ago. And in 2021, we finally released a strategic plan. So we have a strategy. Yay, go us, right? Because we were founded as an organization because there were these chapters of young farmers who were sitting around tables and were just like, man, this sucks. And like, no one is talking about the things that could help us do our work specifically, because it's just our needs are very unique. I'm paraphrasing. And so they were like, we need to have presence in Washington, D.C. if we're going to make change. And it was a very white and a very privileged group of farmers who started the organization. And that's what our organization looked like for a very long time. Until we had a colleague, Michelle Hughes, who is different than the Michelle Hughes that we currently have on our team. Started to be like, hey guys, racism and agriculture, right? Because we often, a lot of our work in progressive movements is thought of by women of color, and they're the ones who are doing all the hard work, and then we get to, you know, take that and make careers out of it. So what we really started to do was like start on this journey, right? And there were a lot of people who were like, we do not want to talk about racial equity. That's not important. Farming is hard for everyone. I'm a farmer and I haven't had anything handed to me, right? But we have all of the numbers. We have all the numbers, and I'm not going to quote them at you because you can go and look them up because they're very, very well reported. So what is our strategy that we keep? One, it's non-negotiable. We're talking about racial equity. If you don't want to be part of that coalition, I'm sure the Farm Bureau is happy to have you, right? So movement building, that's one of the big picture, like three different things that we have woven together. Movement building is what our organization is doing to what I refer to as unsplinter, right? Progressive movements, we're super good at tearing each other down, just like so good, right? We go for this like moral purity and perfection, and you are not as woke as we are, and we will not work with you, right? Because that thing that you said that one time 4 years ago. So that is a really, really awesome strategy if you want to get nothing done and feel really good about yourself. So we don't want to do that. We want to get shit done. Right? So we are unsplintering, we are building coalitions we are building a movement across the country with other organizations, partners, and governments who all want to get the same thing done. That is not to say that we are willing to give up on our values that are very clearly outlined, right? But anyways, grassroots organizing. We are working with farmers who themselves are experiencing all of the challenges that most of our staff, who are also former farmers, have experienced. So we work with fellows. We have a program where we train farmers to tell their story, to learn about the mechanisms of advocacy that they can pursue, and then we give them the infrastructure to be able to like get at that. And the chapters program, which I manage, which I guess I should touch on, which is a group of for that. We have about 30 chapters around the country right now, and they are values aligned groups of farmers who work in their local community. And they are the ones who are building the kind of future that we're talking about, right? That's the point of the chapters program. And then policy change, which is just, it is a part of it, and it is an important part of it, and it is an important part of it because that's what we're good at, right? So that movement building, that grassroots work is informed by the experiences that people are having on the ground, by the historical context of how we're working. And then what we do is we make policy change, which is so exciting. So right now, this is a Farm Bill year. And that means that we are taking the Federal Policy Committee, which is how we decide on what policy issues we're going to work on. And that is by a representative group of farmers that are voted in and serve for 2 years. So farmer-led federal policy decision-making process. And then we get to balance realistic, meaning incremental change, with bold, meaning structural change. So that is like a balance that is really hard to strike, and that just pisses everybody off, right? Because the really progressive movement, they're just like, you're not doing enough, you're being too moderate, you're being an incrementalist. And then the conservatives hate us because look at me, like, they're sending me into DC to talk to them. And we're saying things like, you know, racism and all of that, and using pronouns. Oh, don't get them started on that. So if it's so incremental and if it's so moderate, then why am I so excited about it, right? Because this is not just about like one person who just needs to work harder to get past the thing that they are experiencing. Because then when you actually talk to 10,000 people and they're all saying pretty much the same exact thing, that's not a work your way harder out of it. That is a structural problem. And if you're having it, then other people are having it. And if you are a privileged person who's having it, guess what? Right? And every single challenge that we found in our, I don't know who has the survey reports now, every single challenge that white farmers are facing, farmers of color are facing it harder, which should surprise nobody, but you know, there's the numbers. And so what we're doing is making sure that this Farm Bill is going to have some material gains, right? That's really important because we can talk about the like philosophical wins, and that is important. The narrative is important, and I'll touch on that in a second. But we also need to make sure that people are actually getting the resources that they need. And it is an expensive resource. Land, farmland specifically, is a depleting thing. Right now, if you go down the Colorado River, not the big Colorado, this Colorado, all of the land that is being bought up by sand mines right now. So that is prime agricultural land, important ecological infrastructure, and it is getting destroyed. And there is nothing that we can do about it right now in this moment. There is work being done, there is organizing, there's pushing against it, but it's Texas, so we'll see. And so, you know, we're not going to be able to solve everything in this Farm Bill. The Farm Bill in itself is historically a problematic thing, right? Some professor whose class I took, really ingrained in me just how important it is to understand the context of where this thing comes from, right? So why don't we talk about farm labor? Like, why are farm workers and domestic workers excluded from something like the Farm Bill or from other like federal policy, right? And so it's kind of this negotiation between like, we know that you've been screwed over by the government, even maybe specifically by the USDA, you farmer, but we actually really need your participation in this so that we can make sure that it's working for you. And so right now, the Farm Service Agency, which is like the bank of the USDA, has a very friendly director, Zach Ducheneau, who is like a rancher himself. He's the first, I'm pretty sure he's the first American Native person to be like sitting in this role. And we're trying to figure out how to do something. Ready? This is so sexy. How to make sure that FSA loans can provide pre-approval so that someone can have pre-approval before they go and buy a piece of property instead of this like nightmare loop that people are stuck with right now. So those are the material gains. But why the focus on narrative and story? So these fellows are learning how to do things like meet with their legislators, how to write op-eds, right? Because the only, like, if the only people we focus on were our lawmakers. But if you can drum up excitement, right, and you can build a community around the thing and you can like make it personal, that is what people connect to, right? That's what people are going to be like, oh, I can see myself in that. Not beautiful policy briefs that are written very, very nicely. So that emotional appeal is a proven strategy. It's grounded in experience, and it really makes sure that our policy work is addressing the things that it needs to. And then we use data. And so I'm not just tooting my own horn because I had a huge role in working on that report, but that is the kind of, so that's what we refer to as irrefutable data. And when you thumb through that, you'll see not just like numbers and percentages and stuff like that, which I learned all about in Erin's class. But you'll also see stories woven through that touch on one of the items that we highlighted, because stories are another data point, right? So we have these like personal experiences of what is happening right now. Like right now, these farmers are telling their story about what is happening. And then we have the big picture of, 4,000 something responses that were analyzed to show you this, right? So that's, you cannot get trends with one data point, but you can get these. But we only do that every 5 years because at the end of the day, these relationships that we're building up and these like the ways that we're going to change minds and kind of focus the direction is through relationships. It's through trust building. And so does that answer your question? Because I just keep going.
It does, yeah. I really appreciate the point that you're making about narratives being one particular kind of way combined with other sorts of data and expose the difference between a personal problem and structural violence, structural problems, and also about the value of narratives as exposing this kind of intersections between multiple crises. So thank you very much. I'm, as I mentioned before, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm going to do the classic anthropological thing now and jump to the non-human. We'll talk about humans a little bit, and I want to specifically ask Alex, not exclusively about non-human, but
Alex is the non-human.
no, that wasn't what I intended. Alex, I want to ask you specifically about the work that you've been doing on one particular kind of actors and their relationship with other sorts of people that you work with in RGV, specifically invasive species. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the ways that your work shows that these so-called invasive species often become vectors, not just of what we think of as disease, but a broader sense of issues around justice and equity. And I'm particularly interested to hear also how participatory management of these issues opens up different kinds of ways of understanding the fact they're going on.
Right. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's going to come back to people. So and then, but first of all, I'm gonna disagree with Carolina in that more people have probably learned from you as a non-academic than students have learned from me. I mean, you've been just a tremendous asset to the National Young Farmers Coalition, and it's great to have you there. And you know what? Being a potato, there's nothing shameful about being a potato. You put 1/4 of a potato with 2 eyes in the ground, it'll generate, 20 times its yield. So you take a lot of pride in being a potato. So to answer your question, Jason, I'll just kind of start with a narrative. I'm working with some farmers right now that spray their fields 4 times a year with Roundup or with some derivative of glyphosate. And they kind of have to because the seeds that they buy require it, either in terms of like pre-planting or terminating it. It could be cotton, it could be Roundup Ready corn, it could be, another grain, for example. And these farmers aren't necessarily out there just thinking, oh, I'm gonna nuke this field, and I'm gonna, they're trying to deal with those multiple crises of having to deal with, fluctuating prices, having to anticipate, 2 inches of rain and then a 19-inch of rain of flood. And they're making decisions that are presented to them as part of a recipe on how to be the most successful that they can be, which includes farming, which includes using herbicide against a weed, but also includes maybe heavy tillage. And so, we're dealing with these invasive species that are invasive because we don't want them to be there. And probably because they're going to be direct competitors for something else that's being planted in the ground. Now, these same farmers, they tell me, they said, hey, Alex, I mean, if you can, I farm 15,000 acres here in the Rio Grande Valley. And if you can just save me from spraying my fields one time less a year, I am putting that money into my pocket and not putting out into the environment. How do I deal with these in a way that I can do that? And so, like, we're looking for these different strategies that might include kind of a reduced tillage model, that might include a strategy like cover crops, or that might include a strategy like biological control. To just think about different modes that could be more beneficial to the farmer, and then for everyone that has both a private benefit and a public benefit. And so we have to look for those strategies together. So for example, we're doing trials on this guy's farm, the guy I mentioned to you, who spends more than $1 million a year on herbicide. Now, of course, it goes up when the price of herbicide goes up, which in the last 2 years have gone up by 125% by about 4 or 5 times what it was going for in 2018. And so these these strategies we're doing at scale that farmers understand. They're the ones implementing and suggesting different strategies. We kind of look at the data together. We re-strategize for the next year. And so I run at this moment something called it's a USDA sponsored project called the Conservation Innovations Trials Project. We're one of the few programs in the country that does this, and we do it with the participation of our farmers. Using an endogenous participatory action process where we ask them to help us formulate the question, which is really rare in academic work. And it actually goes a little bit back to to what Raj said. I mean, it's rare because, first of all, academics, we try to tend to compartmentalize and find the answers to something that's of a curiosity more than a concern. And so, whereas, farmers, they always ask questions based on concern or worry. It's a different kind of origin of investigation, right? And so there's an urgency there, an urgency that's really kind of individual, but not necessarily represented in the academic process that's very common today. Part of which is because most of academic research is being conducted by land-grant institutions. And, as Raj mentioned, there is some history there, where there has been dispossession of the land that was granted to these universities. It starts kind of on that platform. And now, it has become really an enterprise where questions are being asked without the participation of farmers per se, but have other voices that can kind of influence the process of research and investigation. So we try to break that model. We try to break that model at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. We're not an ag land grant institution. In fact, I argue often by saying, look, we do systems research, participatory systems research on food and ag, and not necessarily ag research in the sense where we're trying to compartmentalize things. So, we actually just a couple of weeks ago invited some of these farmer participants to dinner here in town. We had a few drinks. I got really their take on it. And just to ask them their honest opinion of the progress so far. We're almost at a 2-year midpoint of our project, and this is not necessarily research. I mean, Jason, I don't want you to report me to the IRB, but this was a genuine conversation based on trust, right? And it was so enlightening to hear their response. Like, well, how do we deal with these invasive weeds? How can we get away from using, these herbicides because I'm losing money? Can we try conservation tillage? Well, yeah, we have farmers who've tried conservation tillage, but when that weed is in that field and it overwhelms them, they have to do a deep tillage. There's no other strategy. And so, I think, having these conversations, these human conversations, that as Carolina said, just checking in with the farmers, and understanding some of the challenges, that they're dealing with, and then putting that into the context of our work. I think that's important. And I'll say this, right? I think we're all used to dealing with a poly crisis, and there's probably no better person who's dealt with that than a farmer, right? I myself farm a 5-acre farm. It's a university farm, but we're trying our very best to make it a new model of agriculture in the Rio Grande Valley, in the country and state for that matter. And it's difficult. We deal a lot of issues on farm. Then suddenly, a family member gets sick, and you have to deal with that crisis. So we're used to dealing with this on a personal level, right? And so the work that we're trying to do is using and leveraging some of those personal relationships to try and identify patterns. Like Carolina said, if one person says it, that's one thing, but if 10,000 people say it, it's another. And then using that to identify what's the question we ask, because then that question is one that includes others and not just kind of created by university researchers like myself, who have a tendency to just kind of focus on that next paper, as Raj mentioned, that next policy paper, that piece that gets read by a dozen people. A dozen people read Raj papers, then that means only like 1 or 2 read mine. And so, we're really hoping that this model of work is something that is something that we can use as a example of how to do this kind of meaningful work on the ground.
Thanks, Alex. I think that there's a really interesting sort of thematic emerging amongst all these answers about the need to think about and diagnose this thing, if we want to call it the polycrisis or whatever, from below. I really appreciate the framing that you've offered around that. And I think I'm going to ask a sort of a similar question to Ben and Doris. Doris, when you introduced yourself and the way that West Street works with this notion of multiple crises, you used the term sacrifice several times to talk about the place where you live, the place where you work. I'm really interested in so I noted that West Side uses the term resilience. Or West Street, I'm sorry.
Feel that all the time.
Use the term resilience a lot in the literature you guys put out on your website and so on and so forth. As someone who's worked a lot on climate change, I'm kind of used to seeing this term get deployed a lot by NGOs and state officials who in some sense are saying, you people who live in sacrifice zones, the state's not going to help you. And you're going to have to figure out how to do it on your own. And it tends to be this sort of very technocratic approach to thinking about what resilience means. I get the sense from knowing you guys and from reading your material that you have a sort of a really different understanding of that term. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what resilience means to West Street and how it plays into your work and the kind of things that you guys do to foster it in the community that you work in.
I think you said it when you said take care of ourselves. We have instituted hub houses. They are, well, I guess you would call them resilience houses, because resilience seems to be a word that everyone took from us. So all of a sudden, everybody have resilience housing, but we started hub houses. This is what the community came together, and we have houses that are set up in the different zip codes and different things that we work with the community and the neighborhood. These houses have, that they're kind of self-sufficient. And the things that we have in, like kayaks, generators for when the, you know, when the electricity goes out, we have heaters, we have backpacks, we have these houses, first aid kits, and we sent a bunch of us clubhouse captains and their assistants to get their
CPR.
yeah, CPR trained. So we all trained now, you know, for any kind of emergency. And these houses, we set them up in these different neighborhoods because we already identified the seniors that would need help. We know the children that, you know, we know the houses that they're gonna need to keep their medicines and different things cold, like their insulin and stuff. We have insulin sleeves. We have we tried to capture all disasters like wind, and we keep the neighborhood informed. We stay in communication with one another through what we call a WhatsApp. So we can keep our neighbors and everything. They will know when disaster is coming. And if a lot of them have what we call, we have PTSD. So when it starts raining, it's just a heavy rain. You know, a lot of people have a tendency to play back that flood parties. So, you know, to keep them, you give them hope, you talk to them, you encourage. And this is what we do for the neighborhood. I guess everyone has learned by now that where their clubhouse happens and the people that are closest to them, instead of trying to go downtown to the Georgia or Brown, which is going to be overcrowded. And if you can get in, and if anyone can get into our neighborhoods to get us out. So instead of waiting on someone else to do it for us, we did it for ourselves. Yeah, because, you know, like I said, we flood on a regular basis. We have, when I first moved out there in 1967, I think we were the second Black family there. And I had been there 3 weeks when a cross was burned in my front yard. And this was in 1967. Through the years, 3 years, everyone had moved out, the stores, it was stores, it was a nice community. But because there was an influx of Black and browns, we had white flight. I'm not afraid to say it, a bunch of racists did that. So they left. And we became sacrifice zone. Because everything that they could put out there that no one else wanted in the affluent neighborhood, they put it out there where we stayed. And like I said, nothing about us without us. We want to sit at the table. We want to talk about what's going on in our neighborhood. Because people stand somewhere else don't know what we need down here. So
I guess you're gonna pass that to me.
yeah, I'm gonna pass that.
Okay. I think for clarity, did you say? I think it was really clear.
Yeah.
Clarity. No, I think it's really, okay, so let me just say like about my own evolution and my own political thinking is that I have a religious belief that the state is claimable. It is actually a religious belief. That religion is called being a liberal. And I'm not really a liberal by any sane definition of what a liberal is. But what I mean by that is that I think everything, Doris, that you're saying is completely true. And that I still think that it is our job, and we spend so much of our energy telling governments, you cannot do this anymore. You have to do it differently, which is really similar to what you were saying at the beginning. What I think when we talk about building resilience, a lot of what we're doing is demanding equal protection. So like we use Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to demand, the state of Texas got $4.2 billion of flood mitigation money, and they sent $0 to the city of Houston, $0 to Port Arthur, $0 to Corpus Christi, $0 to Beaumont. And so you cannot be resilient, or you have to be resilient way more often than you should when they send no money to the places that that were the most impacted by flooding in the last 15 years in Texas. So we filed a Title VI complaint to HUD that has been upheld, and we hope it goes to the Department of Justice. Yeah.
Can I ask where the money went? You know?
Yeah, the money went to build like evacuation routes from the Walmart in Grange to like the richest person in Grange's house and things like this. And they also haven't spent all of the money yet. And Puya, who's sitting right there, has been working with us. And just in terms of partnership and sort of resilience, the real thing is that we have no lawyers on our staff. And so what we did is we tried to find an organization, which we found, Texas Housers, who sort of habitually are filing Title VI complaints. I think it's like what you guys do for fun. And we were like, we need to talk about this. And there are other lawyers, but I think it's really important to say that when Harris County got their share of the money, which they just did, after promising that they would spend the money equitably. Now, let me remind you, Harris County is run by the rising star of the Democratic Party in Texas. Lena Hidalgo is very smart and caring person and stuff, has a 4-to-1 Democrat majority. And they basically put forward a method of distribution that was exactly the same as what the General Land Office's method of distribution is. Because that logic of like, okay, we just can't protect Doris's neighborhood. It's too hard. It's going to take too long. We never did the studies in the past. We have to spend the money quickly. We don't want to get in a fight with the state of Texas. They're like literally negotiating against themselves. So they started with this plan that they were going to score every project based in equity. They were going to, address the historic inequities. They made that plan with their own money. They didn't do it. And Doris, you look like you're about to say something.
No, I'm just.
Okay, so we found that out by basically doing public records requests. Like they didn't admit that they had this huge racial funding gap problem. Then they said, don't worry, we're gonna get the federal money, and we're gonna solve this problem. Then they got the federal money, and they're saying, oh, we can only spend half of it to fix the gap because we have to spend it in 4 years. And I just have to say that those are the people you have to worry when they say, oh, you guys are just so resilient. Like it just means the ability to suffer, but at the same time, we're making these demands on them because people like Doris shouldn't have to flood over and over again. And also because then there are things that communities can do. I have anarchist sympathies and all these anarchists come after disasters, right? They like show up, like I was one of those, they like show up and they're like, yeah, we don't need the government. And the fact of the matter is like to build a massive detention basin, you like actually need a government. But like to muck a house or to give out food or to help people fill out applications, there is nothing worse than a government. But like to actually build these massive things, you need a government. And so that's where our struggle is with resilience is like, okay, we want to be resilient, but also some of this should not be our job. And one of the most infuriating things is when you go and you're like, there needs to be equity on this funding that you promised there would be equity on. Harris County commissioners are like, okay, Miss Regina, explain to us how to do that. And it's like, that's their job. They run the flood control district. Our job is like to set up a hub house or like cook your neighbor's soup when they're sick. Like that's important stuff. And that's like how you build trust. But ultimately, we shouldn't all have to be hydrological experts and understand like cement mixing techniques. It's not possible. So I guess the resiliency thing is like live to make it so you don't have to keep doing that over and over again. I lost the question.
But they had promised us that they didn't get a dime until the city of Northern County, either one told us that, well, there's nothing we could do. But what we stepped up and filed a Title 6 along with houses. When they get the money, they lied to us. You know, we're gonna fix y'all first, worst first, and all this, that, and the other, and we got these plans and stuff. And then when you get the money, from our efforts, you turn around and do a 3-6, turn around, want to go back the same way you went. You supposed to be a 180 and come in and, you know, so, yeah.
I just want to say one thing about the policy fight. So one of the things that we've found doing flood mitigation work is actually the policy from Harris County and Houston is really good. There's not a policy problem. They made an equity score. They have 7 diversity inclusion consultants looking at the plan or whatever, and then they just don't do their own plan.
Yeah.
Then there's like an institutional inertia. And I think that to do what they were always doing before. And I think that one of the problems that policy people have, and we work with a lot of professional advocates, and once they pass the equity scoring matrix, they just freaking stop paying attention. And Doris is like, by the way, they aren't building anything over here. Like the policy doesn't actually happen. You know, it just, there's no implementation of the policy. And then they say like, well, we ran out of time to implement policies, so we have to go back to what we were doing before. So yeah, you were talking about all that stuff, and I was like, that's good, but like, are you guys monitoring that they're doing it?
Oh, I mean, the way that we talk about policy is, and the way that we do our organizing is like, it is a slog.
Yeah.
You know, the policy isn't in the little wins that we get every now and again. It's in the waking up tomorrow after just getting clobbered and doing it again. And again, and again, and again, and again, until we are all potatoes back in the ground, right? So yeah, because like checking off, like you're saying that's good policy, that's shit policy. That's just like a veneer of policy, but policy isn't actually meaningful at all until it hits the ground, until, you know, someone is being able to have affordable housing, not get flooded every time there's a rain, you know, not be worried about whether or not you can put in climate resilient infrastructure on your farm, because that landlord might change their mind next year about whether or not to renew your lease or whatever, right? So so policy, like, right, is just one of the words, but the thing is in the implementation. Right, that's where it's actually meaning. Yeah, very strong. I stole some of your time, Erin.
No, no, it's just looking at, okay. Look at question. Thank you there.
There'll be time for some questions as soon as I.
Didn't you want to talk?
So, you know, I think that Ben's response in some sense brings up one of the kind of challenges and limits of the question of co-production that you were raising earlier in your framing. And so I'd like to ask you a little bit about that and about the sort of the relationship of co-production to some of the early warning systems that you were talking about. So it seems like we're sort of in an era where a lot of technical sophistication is being brought to the table to think about things like flood action plans and so on and so forth. And that these, in my experience, often tend to be mechanisms to alienate other interested parties from the co-production process, more so than bring them in. So I'm wondering what kind of possibilities you see in rethinking co-production. I'm trying to preview your talk.
Okay, so I mean, I think that, you know, the idea of co-production is not new to me at all. This is something that science and technology studies folks have been kind of playing with a lot. It's also really common in kind of climatological services and climatological delivery in the United States. And the idea here is that you should be talking to ranchers and farmers to figure out what exactly do they need in terms of kind of information about the weather so that they can make decisions around when to plant, when to hold off, what might be in forecast for the next handful of months or even longer if you're looking at an like an El Nino event. Because you can kind of potentially know, if you know a lot about El Ninos, you might be able to pick particular varietals that are going to do better or worse, right? And so the idea is really to kind of very much kind of collaborate with the folks who are the ones who are ultimately going to be impacted by the hazards that you're looking at. And I think what's quite hard about that is that takes away some of the decision-making power of the folks who are producing models. Because you suddenly have to open up to being like, okay, well, what do you want? And how might we deal with this? And can we do this? And what are the assumptions that we have that are maybe not correct, right? And that's kind of, that's a really hard tell, both in terms of kind of people letting go of their kind of technocratic dreams, but also it's a really hard sell because it takes a lot of time, I think, to do this. We've not done it successfully yet. Like, we're just sort of starting. But, especially if I think about kind of returning to the example in East Africa, policymakers, so not even getting down to the farmer and rancher level, but like policymakers being like, we know there's a drought. We don't know what to do about it, right? Like, I mean, so it's like, how do you kind of start thinking about like, what are the kinds of responses that are actually going to be helpful to people? And the only way to know that is by going to talk to the folks themselves, right? Like, it's not policymakers kind of making a best guess as to what to do with this forecast. And so I think, I think that's just echoing kind of this possibility of, having like functional early warning and having it being implemented in a way that's valuable requires participation, but it also requires this idea that states are in fact claimable, and that there's some kind of greater responsibility to affected populations than certainly there exists at the moment in humanitarian crises. I mean, I think a lot of folks have written about, affected populations being relatively ignored, and I think that this is a space where you can really see an opportunity to change that, but it's not easy because it takes time. I think, as everyone has indicated, right, there's trust needs to be there. If you're going to give people advice about what to do with their lives, like, you don't want to be wrong. And you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's going to be valuable to them. So it's slow, I think, is my answer. That's what co-production looks like at the moment.
So I have lots of questions that I'd love to ask you all based on your answers, but I think we've got about a half an hour left. It probably would be a good time to open the field or open up to the audience. But I also want to include the panelists in that opening up and encourage you all to ask questions of each other as well, since this is meant to be a conversation, a set of short presentations. So with that, let me ask if there's anybody who would like to start off with a question. Yes.
And Laurie, would you introduce yourself too?
I'm Laurie Green in the history department, and I'm writing a book on a historical book on this called Discovering Hunger in America, that looks at the 60s and 70s and certainly connects to the issues discussed here, but is looking at kind of the layers of the politics of hunger from the grassroots on one end, and the Black Panthers in their breakfast program, and politicians and physicians and media people that all constructed this narrative or competing narratives of hunger that had a huge impact on the way that policy was constructed in like both good and very problematic, like in terms of making food stamps a universal program, and WIC, founding WIC, and a number of others, but kind of and looking at how multiple groups of people related to each other, not only hierarchically, but also in a geography that included people in very different circumstances around the country, and was also multiracial, and how did people who were totally attuned to their own problems actually develop the ears to hear each other's issues. So, I mean, that's the little piece of what I'm writing on. And I was realizing in talking about the different language that people used that is being formally called polycrisis, that it's really hard to structure a book when you're doing that, because it's not single issue, right? And it's not, you can't isolate a group of people. So it's been really hard. And I wanted to, I wanted to ask a question about this term polycrisis. And I like Jason's question, I think it was to you, Raj, about what does that open up? But I wonder if having a term from the academy like that, what would be a term that was coming from the ground, from struggles on the ground? And, you know, is there a problem from the get-go in having a term that might compete with how people in communities might define it? And so I'd love to hear what people think about that. And just from like my historical work, starting in different movements that were going on, particularly around in 1967, actually, Doris. And in a certain sense, for people, it all boiled down to respect. No matter what it was, it boiled down to respect. But when there were investigations from the government or non-governmental organizations on hunger, people who came to hearings in local places were furious, because taking hunger out of all this whole set of problems that was happening at a time of economic restructuring, of the heights of social movements, you know, all of this, that people were angry about singling out hunger. So right there, you know, there was a problem, and that leads to a problem with everything that has to do with governmental policy. So then, I mean, just to forward, I would say that it's really important to see all of these issues as political, which I think that everyone does, but just to make a category of that, it's not that I'm sure everyone's on the same page with disaster being, you know, just natural, right? But having all these different determinants, and the people at the grassroots who really understand that the best. And so in terms of policy, God, it really needs some, you know, such deep discussion that you all were having, you know, particularly between Ben and Carolina. I mean, I'll finish up with this, but say the winning of it's something as important as WIC, supplemental food program for women, infants, and children, was that it saved lives. It absolutely made the rates of infant mortality go way down, but it was also a defeat, because women in the welfare rights movement and people in all kinds of mobilized communities around multiple crises, they wanted to control what was going on, and they knew that they were being disrespected, and that, I mean, quite literally, you find in the archives that they were being disrespected, you know, like, well, your problem is just that you don't know how to cook, right? Right. So the policies were all defined in ways that either criminalize people, like, you know, people will traffic and whip coupons. But anyway, so from the ground, like, these were multi-dimensional, and then they get to the level of policy, and they're not. And then I guess the big question that I have is how is coming back to the term, and if it weren't polycrisis, like what are people hearing in language that is not from the academy, but that might become something like my first book was called Battling the Plantation Mentality, and that was something that I talked about in very academic ways, but that I was hearing in oral histories over and over again. And I'm just wondering if that term poly crisis, given that it is sort of community level, nobody working in community is a single issue. So there we go. And I very long-winded. I'm sorry for that. It's all your fault, Erin.
Doris, not to put you on blast, but didn't you just say, oh, polycrisis, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I like that. I like that word, because that's what we live in. And has been living in, but it didn't have a name or a meaning for us. You know? Okay, I was back there in the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was the People's Party too. And the ones in New York, California that started that, because the government was unresponsive to the needs of the Black women, because they were having kids, they were unable to take care of their kids because you couldn't get milk, you didn't have money. And so this is an idea that the government stole from after they killed them off and started the WIC program. That was one of the things that they took from the people, from Black families. Yeah. So, and I'm the eldest of 8 kids. My mother and my stepfather always had a garden. We always had a garden with all kind of vegetables and things in it. And this supplemented the income that they made. Both of them worked, but this supplemented the income because I was good. No.
Are you saying that WIC supplemented the income or
No.
food stamps?
No, my mom didn't.
Oh, the garden.
And food stamp type things, because she said we were beggars.
Yeah.
So we raised everything.
Garden.
They were from Louisiana, and they raised almost everything. And we went on hunting trips, so we wouldn't have that. So, but as I got older, I saw things that I did not like. And I guess I started standing up for them as a child, because I witnessed things that I did not understand at that time. But I just knew they weren't right, so I wanted to fight that. And I didn't mean physically. I wanted to fight it with the protesting, the boycotting, and all these different things at that time. And I still believe that as a mantra. It's not right, I was going to fight. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that is some of the things that I did. I was also a member of the Black Panther Party. And it was after I was a part of the civil rights peace movement. And after they killed off the peace movement people, yeah, I became a Panther because that strategy did not work. And I felt like that was the only thing they might understand at that time. I'm through with that.
And now he works at an NGO.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to respond to that?
I
or-
think, Erin, that you talked about how farmers like live the poly crisis. I'm wondering if you, like, how do you think farmers, how do you think farmers can talk about their lives?
We were talking to a lot of people who are experiencing mental health crises. Ongoing. Because that is what happens too.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's like a lot of desire for building up like these solidarity networks that used to exist, and these, like especially living in the South, there's such deep history of organizing. And we don't know how to do that anymore, and like we don't know how to negotiate with each other and be in community and like hate each other and then still know that we're coming together to fight on like the same thing. And I see it constantly. And I don't know how you convince people to stop bickering about, these things, or like how to come back together. It takes a long time. Like it kind of like I think there's a lot of parallels between like agriculture and organizing, and that like our generation has been separated from them, and so we actually don't know what it looks like, and then we're gonna kind of trying to be pulled back to it, and it sucks because we don't actually have the skills that are necessary for it. And so we're sort of piecing it together and doing our very best, and a lot of my work is like coaching people through crisis. And like an organizing crisis, and a lot of it is rooted in people just like being at their wits' end and just not knowing how they're going to feed their family, and like, you know, and like during Winter Storm Uri, I was a student here, and we mobilized and raised $260,000 or $200,000 or something like that, and distributed $1,000 cash grants to farmers around Texas, and it was exhausting, and it sucks because it didn't do anything. It didn't change anything, because like Texas Department of Agriculture wasn't doing anything. And FEMA wasn't doing anything. They were turning farmers away. And $1,000 is gonna maybe like get you like some groceries for a couple of weeks, maybe if that, right? But I watched my partner as we were finally able to get out to the farm after the roads were clear, and I watched them break down as we walked the fields and saw that everything was gone. And we have when I say we have every privilege at our disposal, I mean every privilege at our disposal, and it still wasn't enough to shield us from that, right? And so that if that's, you know, that's and we had organizers as we had like a university was like working with groups that had done disaster relief, and they were like, what did you enjoy about the resilience of this work? And I just was like, no. I was like, don't you ever say that word to me again. Like I was like, there was nothing joyful about this. This was because we had to, because nobody else was going to do this. I'm like, yes, it is important in organizing to build in moments of joy and fun, and humor is one of the ways that I really like to do it. But it was horrible. And I have, every time that it freezes and I start to see it happen, I feel my body start, because I don't even remember like months of that time, because it was just, it was traumatic. Right. And that is what people are facing every day in our network, every single day. And so what we do, you know, structurally speaking, is we had to put in a code of conduct, right? And this is like the really, I don't know, like boring part of the work, but we had to say, you cannot call our staff and cuss them out and question their legitimacy, like as people, just because like, they're here and available to you to know that, right? We had to set in some boundaries and say it is not okay to harass our staff because you're in a crisis. And at the same time, we're really hard to take a humanitarian, like a human approach to it, a humanistic approach to be like, yeah, you're going through a lot right now, right? And so, you know, it's a negotiation, it's constant negotiation between like, this is not acceptable. We are working on this like on a structural level. And also people are experiencing things in real time. And if there was like an easy answer, I'm sure I would make an app and make a bunch of money off of it. But there isn't, and technology can't shortcut human relationships for us. It just can't.
I have just one thing to say about that, about the fighting thing. Like, I think for us, maybe we're just really lucky and we're really small, but I do think that the direct work that we do is so like curative for that, because people do feel this sense like, okay, well, at the very least, like they cut the mold out in like my daughter's bedroom, and like these people are, they at least did that. Like, even if this guy really is pissing me off, like he did do this one thing. Then the other thing I was going to say is at Westview, our youngest staff was born in 1999. Doris was born in 1949. And we have an intergenerational approach. And I do think a lot of times that is like so helpful for, we talk about like keep your eyes on the prize a lot in terms of like little individual things. And it's like, it's not about resolving those things. It's not about absolving those things. It's about like, okay, did you do you still want to move together with us? And the thing is, like, no one has to be there. So it's like, if you don't want to keep moving together with us, then like, best of luck. And I will say, we have a lot of people in the Northeast Action Collective that have actually been kicked out of or asked to leave other spaces. And like, there is so little problematic behavior that happens in those meetings. And I think it's like well, Doris, I think you have a lot to do with it, just like your presence and like to really lead the space and set the tone for the space. But also I think there's like a kind of collective thing that like we're all learning. And one thing I have been saying is like, we actually don't, anyone who tells you they know the answer is full of shit. Because we don't know the answer, that's why we're in a poly crisis or whatever. So, but I do think the intergenerational thing can be really helpful.
And I think I'm starting to see more of our organizers on staff are starting to really, like, just really want that.
Want a whole person.
They want to. Right, and you know, to your point, like intergenerational learning is really important. And I think that for the networks, though, in terms of like the networks of organizing, those I think pretty beautifully dismantled. I say that sarcastically, right? Like those are hard to tap into. And I have there's a farmer in Atlanta that I've been having a lot of conversations with. And he was talking about that intergenerational kind of, because like it takes a lot of negotiating, right? Because like everybody's got to kind of give up a little bit of like, you know, but I'm right, you know, but like I know what's right, you know, and it comes to like both end, but yeah, we have so much to learn from each other. We have so much to learn from each other, and it's just a practice that we have to get back into, and it's easier to avoid conflict than it is to engage with it. I think that's like so. Anyway,
can I pick up the ball before throwing it to Alex? Because I'm really moved by the mental health crisis dimension. That I mean, it's certainly in South Africa again after Ndobukhle and the other comrades were killed. Folk who normally in social movement spaces, which would be filled with lots of different generations of people, you know, figuring out ways of, you know, helping each other out and doing childcare and cooking together and learning together. I mean, you know, one of the things that characterizes a lot of Abbas Valley settlements is that there's always a creche and there's always a community kitchen, a garden, and a classroom that doubles as an adult education center. Right? There's always a school of some kind. Abbas Valley spaces, Abbas Valley is home to the Franz Fanon Political School, where we just had Ruthie Gilmore who was class there like 2 weeks ago, and they've got amazing academics sort of coming through. But the academics who go there recognize that actually this place, the University of Texas, is not a place for free speech. This is a university, and it's whereas in the kinds of, you know, honest, open engagement that you get in a social movement is actually more of the kind of fantasized, imagined, ideal type of intellectual engagement, because you're just raw and honest and engaging and caring. But I mention all that because the folk who are dealing with the wake of the state violence on top of the climate change and all the rest of it have been broken in some very important and very difficult ways. And they found mental health counseling incredibly helpful. They always thought it was just, you know, stuff that middle-class white people do. And it turns out that there was this very nice middle-class white woman who was a therapist who came by and did some sessions with the leadership. And they all said, oh shit, we can sleep now. We haven't done that in 10 years. And that's, I mean, I think this is not to sort of argue for some sort of purity of social reproduction that happens in movement spaces and the sort of natural knowledge that bubbles up from there. That said, I do think that, you know, the ideas that come from from Abbas Valley, where people say we are the professors of our own poverty, is quite important. And where they don't find the term polycrisis useful, but they do like the idea of the commons. And they also like the idea of Abbas Valley. It's just a completely invented word, but it is about this thing that they have discovered of what it is to be in the shacks as a political philosophy. And they're still working on it, and I like it that they've invented the word. But they've invented, well, no, you're right, and they've invented to fulfill the purpose to be able to dignify their own knowledge in the face of the donors, and to be able to say this is what it means for us, because y'all just can't talk our language. But that makes me want to throw it over to you, Alex, because I'm really curious about these conversations you're having with farmers around the inadequacy of the academy and what languages and what ideas you're hearing from them about what they need, whether it's about mental health or anything else that we just haven't talked about.
I mean, it's not necessarily the inadequacy of the academy. I think it's like the priorities that that have been consistent over the years. I mean, because you'll always have, one or two farmers. There's a reason why, for example, I'm getting any traction with some of these farmers, whereas kind of the elephant in the room, which is the Texas A&M system, hasn't yet really fully kind of met them, where they are. And the federal government, USDA, NRCS, they don't even step on their farm, right? And so some of that disconnect comes with the kind of compartmentalization that we do as academics, right? I mean, most of ag science is done on experimental field stations, very controlled conditions, and they don't take into account some of the rural realities that farmers face, or urban realities for that matter, or like, I'll say this, they don't take into account the polycrisis that's behind farming, right? And so they kind of look at soil biology and they're able to manipulate all the variables, but they don't take into account the farmer element, the human element, that is as really the most important element, right? And I'm admitting this to the anthropologists in the room, right? As someone who works with plants, and so ultimately, I think that's where these honest conversations that I have with farmers, I mean, they're genuine, right? I mean, I had a farmer recently ask me, look, Alex, do you really think that climate change is real? And am I the cause of it? Like it says on the internet, that farmers are at the root of climate change, right? So that's a difficult conversation that requires another shot of whiskey, and then we kind of we address it. We find common grounds. We talk about our kids. We talk about our futures and shared values, and we talk about it at that speed of with trust at the foundation, that those responses are going to be listened to, and that we're going to act accordingly, right? And so, I have these farmers who tell me, "Hey, Alex, I'm only doing this I'm only in this project because I want to stick it through." But I'll tell you right now, once this project is over, this research project, I'm not implementing any of these techniques we've tried out because they don't work, right? Now, it takes us academics 4 years of data to show that, but farmers are like, well, we don't have 4 years. That's part of the crises, right? It's not, and so the negotiation that has to happen for me as an academic is like, well, how do I take that information, that genuine information that's shared to me, and how do I translate that to the other communities that listen to me only because I have a PhD after my name, which, is part of that privilege, right? And so I share this message with my students. I share this message in the way that we write our proposals and the way we fund and frame our research. And ultimately, I take that and I translate it into a justice-centered academic platform, which, as you know, Raj, is not rewarded within the academy, right? I mean, it's not part of that metric of impact. And so there is a disconnect, but like with any culture, right? It's somebody like who is at the boundary. It's our responsibility to try to find that common ground. I mean, that and try to find, well, what are the things that we both are concerned about, right? And that day, that conversation I had with you about climate change, it was really just two parents talking over whiskey about our concern for our children's future, and that's how we talk about climate change. It's not as an agronomist talking to a farmer. It really comes down to the things that have worked for generations. So I will say this, like, we don't have the answers, but we do know actually what works. What works are conversations. What works are actually genuine sense of invitation to participate in dialogue. We know that community works. It has worked for millennia, and it's increasingly marginalized, but it still works even when all forces are pushing against it. And so that's the kind of, Raj, to answer your question, that is like kind of that's the core of those conversations. And you know this, I mean, you tried to bring Anita around in your film to meet and build that community with others. And there are some common words that we share, and that even just one brief interaction can kind of help. We're all kind of scholars at heart, because we take the information and we use that information to make decisions. And so we talk with our farmers with expectation of learning as much from them as we can share. And so that, I think, Raj, is really how those conversations go. The whiskey has to be of high quality, though. I will say that. I mean, the beer can be extremely cheap. I can say that too. But the whiskey does have to be good.
And she said that, they use Roundup, weed killer. How does it affect the food that's being grown?
Well, Doris, I mean, Roundup, and there's like several different permutations of glyphosate chemicals, right? I mean, there's all sorts of glyphosate-based chemicals, reformulations. I mean, a lot of the farmers are dealing with super weeds now that you can't even kill with Roundup, or glyphosate for that matter, or those types of. Well, and then and you might know also that like a Roundup is also a registered antibiotic, so it does impact several different antibiotic bacteria that have certain pathways for metabolism. And I don't think we know exactly how it works, but we do know that it kills bacteria very effectively, as well as certain plants. And so, and we also know that the human gut has 2 billion bacteria in it, and I can almost guarantee you that some of those bacteria are going to be impacted by that input. Now, I'm not a gastroenterologist or scientist, but I can tell you that from what I know, it definitely has an impact as well on soil bacteria, and as well as other kind of cascading effects that come with the heavy use of this chemistry. I mean, that chemistry is also linked to like kind of affecting reefs. So like here in the Rio Grande Valley in the Gulf of Mexico, we do have some reefs, artificial, but they do have a lot of fisheries around them. And so, it has an impact there. So it has, I think, multiple impacts that all contribute to this like multiple crises that we see. One chemical, right? I mean, one group of chemicals, they associate with biodiversity loss, health implications. It also is associated, of course, with the kind of commercial production of things, and the success of things like corn, right? Which is all Roundup ready. I would say that 99% of corn grown in the United States is Roundup ready. And so that corn feeds our addiction to high fructose corn syrup. So, I mean, these are all stories that when you guys go out to dinner tonight with Raj, he'll tell you a little bit more about it. I wish I could be there, but yeah, I mean, it's actually it's interesting. I will tell you this, that 5 years ago when we first started our projects with some of these farmers, we were having a hard time really trying to recruit and get them to buy in, because Roundup was only $18 per acre. And now it costs them over $100 per acre to spray the same chemical. I can tell you this: somebody is making money, even though, I mean, it's not the farmer, because it just comes out of their pocket, right? That same farmer I told you about, Doris, this guy told me, I buy the seed at the price they set. It comes with a slew of packages that are all kind of together. I have to buy the Roundup. I have to make sure that I do due diligence. I follow the instructions that are endorsed by some of your colleagues at the big universities. I have to use tractors, and then I have to sell the seed at the price that they set. So the only thing I can impact is the amount of inputs that go in it. And if I can spray less, I keep more. So I think, like there all of a sudden we have a shared common ground, right? As a justice-centered scientist, I do want them to spray less for multiple reasons, for those poly reasons, right? But we find that common ground, and that's the foundation in which we build our relationship, built on trust.
So we clearly should have scheduled this as an all-day session. Unfortunately, at 7 o'clock, which is sort of when we all turn back into pumpkins, and I know some of us have to get home, so potatoes, ground, various different ground boards and whatnot. Many of us have to get home to children, so I think I'm gonna call the session to an end. But I want to thank everyone who is part of the panel for really thoughtful and fantastic and really engaging responses to these questions. This has been a really fabulous